All right, guys, 10 days till archery season, but I'm not going to talk about making a perfect little mew or a perfect bugle. Look, I can even do a little glunk. Listen. Oh, listen to that. Sure, knowing how to make bugles, knowing how to make realistic cow sounds, you got to master that to some extent, but really just to like a low level extent. You just got to make some realistic sounds, but what actually moves the needle is the setup. Once you find elk, from there to when you release the arrow, that's what actually kills elk, and I swear it's probably 10 to 1 in terms of the hours of content of calling versus the setup. It's 10 to 1 is probably grossly underestimating. It's probably 500 hours of calling content out there versus 1 hour of actually getting the setup right. But it should be inverse if we're talking about what actually matters. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. I'll go through it step by step, exactly how I think about the process. Once I found elk, once I set up on them, once I start calling to them, once I set up myself and a hunter I'm guiding, or if I'm the hunter and if I've got somebody calling for me, or if I'm solo, I'll go over all those scenarios. And I promise you, if you think about this stuff, your success is going to go boom. And you're not even going to have to call a bunch. You're not going to have to annoy your family with bugling and cow calls and all this other shit. All you got to do is think about these steps and you will be massively more successful. If you want more depth, really on the nerdy side of things, like what elk I feel they're thinking in this little call-in vocalization ecosystem that we get into this time of year. If you want to know the nitty-gritty, some details actually on the sounds where I go through how I make each sound, when I use certain sounds, how I think about the setup, how I locate elk, all of those things, go check out my course, right? I have a course. It's at pursuitwithcliff.com/elk. Go check that out for details. But without further ado, let's dive into the little, I don't know, what are we going to call this? Like compressed version of what you need right now, 5-10 days away from archery season to make you way more successful once you found the elk. All right, so like I said, I'm not going to dive into the nitty-gritty detail of glassing up elk or locate bugling elk, locate cow calling elk. But I got to talk about it a little bit because it plays into a big theme when it comes to the setups. Absolutely finding elk via glassing. I don't care who you are, the topography, the vegetation, any of that. It is always better to find them that way than it is via vocalization. And the reason is there's a cold, hard truth to setups on archery elk. It's just like playing cards, all right? And that's the metaphor that I'm going to use here. Yeah, metaphor. The reason I'm going to use it is if you're playing cards with somebody, I'm playing cards with the elk, right? I want to take a peek at their cards as much as possible. I don't want them to see any of my cards, right? I want to cheat in cards if I want to, if I really want to win. That dynamic holds true throughout the archery setup game with elk. If you are vocalizing to elk to get them to respond so you know where they're at, you are showing them one of your cards. You're showing them where you're at, and then if you move and continue to vocalize while you're finding those elk, while you're trying to figure out where they're at, you are giving them more peeks at your cards, right? Because now not only do they know where you're at, they know where you're going. And it's not necessarily just the bull that's bugling. That's what gets a lot of archers off. You have to understand that in September, elk are generally in a swirl of elk. That could be one bull with 2 cows and one kind of roaming satellite bull on the edge. It could be one bull with 50 cows with 18 satellite bulls swirling around in a 30-acre spot or a 50-acre spot, right? So it's all relative, but it's usually a swirl of elk. And when you locate vocalize to elk, those elk across that swirl, across that herd and extended dynamic of the herd, they all know exactly where you're at. And then if you keep doing it, they know the direction of travel. And I guarantee you, it may not be the bull in there that's tending cows and raking shit and going berserk, but there are elk in that group that are now paying attention to you. This is probably the biggest mistake, to throw one out there on the backcountry front. The biggest mistake I see guys way back in the wilderness make, because they've been grinding to try to find a bull that's vocalizing back to them. They get a vocalization from a bull because they're up on a rim. They did the right thing. They got the wind where it's taking that call to the bull, crisp morning. They got that bull bugling, and they can't believe it. Like, I've watched guys, I've glassed guys, seen them vocalize, and the 2 or 3 guys are just, it's like they're having a birthday party over there because they heard a bull bugle. The problem is immediately they want to vocalize again because they want to hear that bugle, right? That is the worst thing you could do, because now you're giving away more information. And then a lot of times what they do is, maybe that bull is 1,200 yards away. They start to stalk to that bull. They get 800 yards away. They vocalize again. So now that whole herd, that whole swirl of elk knows exactly where those guys are and exactly the direction of travel. This is a huge problem, and this falls into why a lot of these guys, I cannot tell you how many times on the trail, I've been riding down the trail, and I talk to guys that I observed that morning, and it's always the same story. We got this bull bugling, seemed like he was real aggressive, but we must have bugled too aggressively because we watched him circle up, take his cows, and get the hell out of there. Almost always, what that is some elk on the periphery heard you vocalize, maybe not the first time, but for sure the second time, was looking for you, either didn't see a cow or saw you, the hunter, right? And the thing, I'm throwing a lot of topics in here, but these are truths. Elk, they hear with their ears like we see. An epic new giveaway is up on my website, pursuitwithcliff.com/fill your freezer. All the details are there. It includes a guided hunt with me, some awesome Revic optics, an unknown suppressor Reaper, a full pack and frame system from Cafaro, a big box of biltong slabs, an Invader Concepts holster, unknown musicians, complete custom Tika build with the rock stock. I'm gonna give it away on a live stream, a Q&A on September 17th. But go to the website right now, pursuitwithcliff.com/fill your freezer. Sign up, enter the giveaway. I'll see you guys there. So right now I'm in my house. Downstairs, one of my kids is raising hell, right? I don't know what appliance they're next to or what chair they're next to in the living room or, any of that. I just know that, okay, they're downstairs and maybe they're in that northeast quadrant of the house, right? Or maybe they're in that room. I kind of have that feeling of detail with when I hear my kids. But an elk, when they hear you, they know exactly what trail you're on. And in a lot of situations, they basically know the exact tree you're next to, right? They see with their ears. That's the best way to think about it. So when you give them that extra vocalization, boom, they're looking and they're thinking, that country is pretty thin. There's not a lot of cover there. I should see a cow elk's ass. I walk around the woods all the time. I'm a bull elk or I'm a cow elk that's just watching, and I see other elk all the time, and I know an elk should be there. And there's no elk there. There's kind of a little kind of weird looking camouflage bush or whatever, but there's no elk there. I'm getting the hell out of there, out of here, because this is not right, right? And so what happens is, that elk on the periphery, either cow, could be a satellite bull, whatever, starts barking or just starts running up through the rest of the group. And the rest of the group, they read off that. They're herd animals. They get their shit and they get out of there. And usually the cows run out and the bull's he's not circling them up and pushing them out. He's just following the cows because that's what guys do, right? So that's what you're seeing there in that situation. And that comes from locating elk via vocalization and then continuing to vocalize to them when you don't need to. So lots of concepts in there that are gonna trickle through the rest of this setup deal that you need to understand. Now, of course, I'm sure a lot of you guys are yelling at the screen. Well, the topography and vegetation that I'm in, I can't glass. And that's totally reasonable. That's totally a reality, right? I'm just saying that puts you at a slight disadvantage to just glassing up animals. If you've got to vocalize, just realize that you're throwing a card on the table that those elk can see right off the bat. The other thing here is that you need to try to pick up a few things from the elk before you make any move at all, right when you locate elk via glassing or vocalization. You need to figure out where the elk are at right now, You need to figure out where they're going, if and where they're moving to, and you need to figure out herd composition. These are huge as we get into the setup, and the reason is, I was going to wait on this, but I have to explain this right off the bat here. So there's a dynamic that is, again, a universal truth when it comes to elk call-in setups. And there's a lot of different ways I can explain this, and I'll do it a couple different ways because it'll click probably for different people if I explain it in a couple different ways. I'm going to use duck calling as an analogy here. If you're a waterfowl hunter and you've hunted much at all, and you're not just at the early stages of being naive, you'll know that all the guys for the last 40 years that have been marketing goose and duck calls, and I'm not saying that there's not a in-depth skill set there in calling ducks and calling geese. I have spent hundreds of hours short reed goose calling, mallard calling, all of that. I'm a pretty damn good waterfowl caller, to be honest with you guys. Not to, I know it's outside of my little YouTube niche here, but the reality is I am not trying to be a total egomaniac, but I guess what I'm getting at is I respect it. But in the marketing of those calls, what you'll see is a bunch of guys that already have their decoys and already have their blind where the ducks and geese already want to land. That's the key. If you want to be the best waterfowl hunter on planet Earth, be in the pond that the ducks are going to land in already, and then do a little calling. Maybe you manipulate them in a little bit. Regardless, it looks really damn good on a marketing video, on a piece of content, right? So that exact thing exists in the elk hunting world too. So a lot of the content, there's less of it now because there's a lot more transparency with all the content that's coming out there. But some of the old school content, like back when, these diaphragms, contrary to what people think, these were first used in the turkey woods. And I think Wayne Carlson brought them out west. Whoop, whoop, whoop. And he started, these calls showed up, and then what they depicted in the content was, in these videos, was a bull on the other side of a canyon, 1,000 yards away. They'd hear the bull, and then they'd just set up, and the bull would come running to them from 1,000 yards away or 800 yards away. This is completely false in the dynamic of elk hunting. I'm not saying that it can't happen, but it's so very rare that it really shouldn't be a part of the discussion, right? Like the 1,500 yard call in across a bunch of topography. It's super rare. And what's more important to understand, though, is that each incremental chunk of distance that you get closer to the elk, it is a astronomically exponential, that's totally made up, but it is like an exponential curve in terms of your success of getting that bull to respond to you. So if I set up on a bull from 150 yards, the success rate at 150 yards in terms of getting him to come into my call-in setup, it is less than half the success if I wait until I'm within 100 yards of the bull before I set up, right? So I get double or more the success rate if I just close the distance by a third or so, right? And these are rough, but this is basically what I've seen in my experience, and most guys that get in a lot of reps here, they'll tell you the same thing. And then if you can go from 100 yards, if you can magically get to 75 or 80 yards, just 20%, 25% closer, and it's really hard to do that. But if you can do that before you make a peep, before you do that final setup, it probably doubles or triples again, right? So anytime you can get as close as possible before doing that final setup, your success at getting the bulls to come in goes way up. This has totally been kind of pushed to the side in decades of content, but this is a truth, right? You want to get in there as close as possible before you do that setup. My buddy James Nash, he calls it the idea of nudging the elk to you, and I think that's a perfect way to think about it, right? You're not going to get these bulls to do something crazy versus either where they're at or where they're going. Like in extreme cases, if bulls and cows are ahead of you and you get behind them, even if your wind's perfect, all of that's great. The chances of you getting a bull that's already traveling ahead with a group of elk, getting him to turn and swim upstream against elk and come into your call setup, almost zero. You have almost 0% chance of successfully calling that bull in. But if you can quarter in there, and I'll get into this more as the video goes, if you can quarter in there, get set up, have decent wind, and get them just to nudge off that path and come to you 40, 50, 60, 80 yards, your success rate goes way, way up in terms of actually getting them in to that call-in setup. All right, guys, in some of my content, you're gonna see that I've been using this chest holster from Invader Concepts. This is with my 10mm. I also use it with my Glock 19 and even a PMR 30. I'm gonna do a bunch of content here in the next couple months on that around bear defense. It should be interesting. It looks a little awkward to have your gun under your bino harness, but if you test out all the different variations, it is the best and you have it on you all the time. I do have a discount code. It's CliffG and it's for 10% off. Go check them out. All right, so the natural question is why? I believe you, Cliff, but you got to tell me why. I've watched a ton of elk, and this is the conclusion that I've come to. There's two reasons that bulls, and it could be a bull that's in the mix, he's tending cows, he's the herd bull, or it could be, you know, periphery satellite bull. They're still infatuated with the herd and the real cows that they're seeing there, right? So how do you get those bulls, any of those bulls, to come into you? And it could be a bull that's way out in the periphery. People call them like a lone bull or whatever. In September, says, you know, they're usually on some wider periphery of elk, but let's assume it's a lone bull. It's kind of the same thing. He's doing his thing. How do you get him to react and do what you want? It's not via some sentence structure that you structure with 15 different sounds to get the bull convinced he can come over. It's one of two things. One, you get close enough in there and you do male elk sounds. So raking, glunking, right? Oh God. Let's see. So raking, right? But you can do raking with the antler. I have a little antler that I carry with me a lot of times. You can do it with a piece of wood. You can actually do it with this little bugle here. You can rake against a tree, and that is an aggressive bull sound, right? You can bugle. You can even glunk. You know, a glunking sound, this sound. That kind of hollowy sound. Bulls do that when they're kind of tending cows, right? So up close and personal, that plus bugles, obviously, if you get in there real close to a bull, a lot of times it just pisses him off and you get a fire off reaction and he'll run over and raise hell with you. And if you watch elk, you know, in big groups during the rut, you'll see this exact behavior. Satellite bulls get in there, you know, they sneak up in there quiet and then they raise hell 55 yards, 30 yards from the bull who's just like, the bull's a stress wreck, right? Because he's trying to keep all of his shit together. He's running around and trying to keep all those cows together just so he can get as much of it as possible and trying to keep everybody away. And then a bull sneaks in there and he fires off, gets pissed, and literally sprints over there, gets up in that bull's face. A lot of times that bull will run off. Sometimes they'll fight a little bit, whatever. But that's what a lot of times you're getting when you get in close to these elk. That's a viable strategy. Most people have been in the elk woods, have seen this in the natural sense, and they've seen it in the call-in setup sense, right? So you get that. That is proximity based. You gotta be close to do that. Bulls don't react that way to a bull that's 800 yards up the mountain, right? Like, he's not gonna just leave all of his cows and run up there and start shit with the bull he knows nothing about up on the hillside. That's not a natural thing for bulls to do. So that's one way. The other way I'd call like a sexual tension kind of thing, right? You're a cow, you're just out of the periphery, he can't see you, he's trying to deal with his cows, or if you're trying to call a satellite bull in, that satellite bull is not focused on random cows out in the wood. That satellite bull is focused on the herd and seeing if he could peel something off, seeing if he can challenge that bull, just kind of minger. He's in the swirl of elk, right? He's not out there looking for a random cow wandering across the hillside, right? And that's what you're mimicking. Now, if you are a random cow 1,000 yards away from the swirl of the elk, I mean, maybe he'll come over. But if you're a random cow that's just out there 60 yards and he's thinking like, man, like so close, it's worth just running over there. I'll get away from the whole herd dynamic, run over there, see what happens. Satellite bulls will react to that. Herd bulls, if you get real close, can react to that too. So, you know, that's pretty much the other way that you're gonna get this reaction. But again, this is proximity related. If you're trying to make sweet little cow mews out there, sweet little nasally cow mews up on the hillside 1,000 yards away, you might as well be walking around with the diaphragm up your ass. It's not going to do you any good. You have to get in a proximity where they're going to react to that kind of sexual frustration. Like, hey, there's an opportunity out there. I'm going to go check it out. And I think this actually plays into the video I did on my calf sounds that I'll do and the strategy I do around when I hear lone calves out there talking to me. I have a mimicking strategy that I use. I'll put the video up right here. Yeah, right here. That's where it'll go. I'll put that video up right here. You can go check it out. But that setup, and that can be used in kind of, I guess, a little bit of a cold calling setup. You can assume that there's no bull anywhere. Usually you're going to only do it when you hear calf sounds, even if they're far away, because calves will come from pretty far distance. I think that's just because they're so desperate to find elk. They're not in the mix. They've purposely been kicked off the herd swirl. They're out in La La Land just looking for some safety mechanism, right? You'll see one calf, 3 calves together. They're usually bull calves. I dive into it in that video, why it exists, why calling those elk in is so easy. But I have a strategy that I implement in that situation. And a lot of the times, bulls show up when you do that strategy, even though you're kind of cold calling the bull, right? You don't even know he's there. It is what it is, but they're clearly viewing that as an opportunity, right? So that works because of that dynamic. So go check that video out. That's kind of like one of the few strategies I see do pretty well in terms of long distance calling in bulls or kind of cold calling in bulls. But it just depicts what I'm talking about here. There's really 2 ways that these elk are coming into you. Now, I went off on this giant aside. And the reason I did that is because it loops back to these 2 things that we need to know right off the bat. Where the animals are moving and the herd composition, because that's going to tell us when we throw in the wind, which is the next thing we need to know, that's going to tell us how close we can actually get. As I already explained, if you can get to 50 yards before you do a call-in setup, that's awesome. But if it's a huge swirl of elk, it ain't going to happen, right? If the animals are moving, it ain't going to happen because you've got elk that are stretched out, right? So you're going to have to adjust how close you can actually get based on what you know about the elk, right? So if it's a huge herd of elk and they're moving already, I might be thinking to myself like, hey, I'm only going to get 120 yards from these elk and then I got to set up, because if not, I'm going to be bumping these animals and that's obviously not going to work. So you do that relative, right? If it's 1 bull and 2 cows, you might try to get in there to sub 50 yards, to 70 yards before you do that call-in setup. And of course, another aside here, I'm sure people are yelling, well, if I can get to 50 yards before I do a call-in setup, I can shoot my bow that far. Why don't I just spot and stalk and shoot the bull? Why don't you? This is a reality, and there's a lot of people who are highly competent that this is exactly how they kill elk in September. It's a way bigger proportion of the hunters out there in the mountains than people think. Just getting up there, being quiet, not giving their location away. Maybe they're locate bugling an hour ago and now they're an hour into the stalk, but they're not going to call unless they have to, right? But a lot of what they're doing is just stalking up there and killing bulls with their bow. Very viable. Don't steer away from it. There are a couple reasons though you might want to have calling in your tool set, right? One, it's just fun. It is more funner. It is way more fun by a shitload to call in elk versus spot and stalk, right? So that is a very viable reason right there in its own right. Why not call them in? Because it's just a whole hell of a lot more fun. The second thing is if you do your setups right, it is easier for most archers to make an ethical shot, and you tend to get closer shots if the animal's coming into you. The reason is you have an opportune time typically to draw if you've done the setup correctly, and you tend to be prepared in terms of the platform, right? You're set up in a spot, the caller's behind you, you're steady there, you can get ranges, you can physically turn your torso, you can tell that you can draw all of those situations. When you're spot and stalking elk, a lot of those are not a given, right? You might have to shoot from kneeling more often. You might be pinned down because a cow's looking at you and the bull's right there. You have a shot, but you got a cow right there. Now you've got to draw with an elk looking at you. There's a lot more pressure in a lot of those spot and stalk scenarios. So sometimes it just makes more sense to do a call-in setup. And then the other part of that is sometimes the terrain, the swirl of elk, all of that, there's just no way in hell you're going to get into archery distance from them, right? They're moving, giant herd of elk. Even the satellite bulls are mixed into that whole group. You're not going to get within 100 yards of them. So you've got to fall back to these call-in setups. All right, so you've got those 3 important things figured out, right? Elk are moving, where they're moving, how fast they're moving, what the wind's doing, and the herd composition. Now, if you're glassing, you know this just by looking at them, right? So a huge advantage of just glassing to find the elk that way. If you're vocalizing back and forth with elk, you're not always going to be able to figure out where they're going or the herd composition, right? And the reason is you should try this just to get it ingrained in your brain. You and your hunting partner are up there in the mountains. You're running along the ridges vocalizing to elk, right? You're doing your locate bugles. Bull fires off. You and your hunting partner hear that vocalization. Up in the mountains, I can tell you, if you ask your buddy before you tell him where the vocalization was, you ask your buddy where that vocalization was, the vast majority of the time, his perception of where it is going to be different than yours, right? This is really problematic. Almost never are you going to get a pinpoint location off of one vocalization back to you. Now, one thing that will help you a lot is when you vocalize quiet, right? People, when they're out there locating elk, a guy will bugle and immediately guys talk or they whisper or whatever. Dead silence. You need dead silence because you might be able to still hear a bull, but you're not going to be able to pinpoint it. Human ears suck, man. You have to be able to pinpoint it. Locate, bugle, listen. Minute and a half. And I like, just so you guys know, if you don't feel comfortable locate bugling, I like a real nasally mew, like a drawn out one. To me, that's like a locate cow sound, right? If all you can do is make cow sounds. I like it. It's kind of like, to me, it's like cutting on a box call, right? For turkeys. For some reason, turkeys will respond to that cutting sound when they won't respond to a yelp. A lot of times bulls will not bugle to your standard mew, but they'll bugle to a kind of nasally mew. I don't know why. And I get it by dropping my jaw. So you can play with that. But anyways, listen after the fact, right? And then if you're confused about, I think it was here and then my hunting partner thinks the bull was there, best thing to do is don't vocalize again. Just keep listening. Listen for 5-6 minutes, for 10 minutes even. And a lot of times you're going to hear a cow. You're going to hear a bull in that area. And you're going to be, now that you're on it, you're going to know the exact spot, right? And then if they're vocalizing on their own, you can also get an idea of, are they moving, right? And at what speed are they moving? That's huge because then you can look at Onyx, you can take your historical knowledge of the area, and you can get a really good idea of where they're going, right? Is it in the morning? It's been light for 45 minutes, an hour, and they're moving. They're probably going to a bedding area, right? So you can use that dynamic to set up your plan. Guys, biltong, okay? I have been obsessed with this stuff for 3 or 4 years. Ever since I got on a keto, carnivore, paleo-esque type of diet, I've had a hard time finding healthy snacks. Biltong is a great option, particularly the slabs that have this fat on the side. That's where your energy is if you're a fat burner like me. Super simple ingredients in this, guys. Literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ingredients. Compare that to your gas station jerky. A great snack in the backcountry or just day to day. Biltong Depot is a huge supporter of my content. Go to their website, biltongdepot.com. Use my code CliffGray, CLIFFGRAY at checkout for 10% off and to support this content. Thanks, guys. All right, so another kind of, shit talking on our hearing as humans is this idea of an elk moving. So I do these elk hunting seminars every year, take a group of guys up in the mountains, and we do mock elk archery setups. like a bunch of them, right? And I'll be the bull, somebody else will be the caller, somebody else will be the shooter. Maybe we'll mix in some cows there, but it's all us. It's all people in the group, right? And we have this awesome feedback loop that we have, because after the setup, we can all go over what was actually occurring, right? So if I've got, you know, Bob and Joe, those guys are the shooter and the caller. I'm over here being a bull. You know, we're mocking up a scenario, right? It's amazing, guys. Like, if you get a chance to do this stuff even on your own, go do it. You got to have 3 or 4 guys to really get like a good feedback loop going, but it is amazingly realistic, and it is very good practice. It sounds crazy, but it's very good practice, and it's a ton of fun. But anyways, during these scenarios, one thing that I have noticed is that if I'm the bull and I am doing a mock scenario where the bull is just tending cows, like maybe I'm just moving in like a 30-yard radius area, just kind of chasing cows back and forth, that scenario, or a scenario where I'm bedded, right? I'm in a little timber pocket and I'm bedded, but I'm bugling. Almost always, the shooter and the hunter, when we do our debrief on the situation, they will think that I was moving 150 yards, 200 yards. You know, I was going to bed, right? They think that there's way bigger moves occurring, and it's because in the mountains, the topography, and then if you throw in wind there, it's even more extreme. A lot of times a bull turning his head this way and bugling is so much different to our ears than if he turns and bugles at us, to the extent that we think he's moved 150, 200 yards. It is amazing how inaccurate our ears are. So the best way to combat that, to get good information, is again, just keep listening. Stay quiet, keep listening. If you can, and elk are being fairly vocal, just listen to them on their own. Listen for trees cracking. Listen for them going through the woods. Listen for any vocalizations. Try to get 3 or 4 data points just to confirm exactly where they're at and exactly where they're going. So now we have the critical data points, and we have an idea of how close we're going to try to get to these elk based on these critical data points, right? So now what we need to do is we need to make an intercept path, right? So if they're in one spot, pretty damn obvious. It's just like any other stalk. Go look at my stalking videos. I'll stick this one up right here. It walks through exactly how I plan a rifle stalk, could be an archery stalk. It's the same in this scenario, right? You got stationary animal, figure out a path with the wind to get close, and then you can do your call-in setup. Now, on elk that are moving, this is where you gotta speculate where the elk are going. You've gotta think about that herd dynamic, the herd composition, because a lot of times these elk will get real spread out when they start to move, right? So you could have, cows way up in the front, and then you've got bulls lagging 600-700 yards behind. You'll get a big stretch of elk depending on how big the group is, what's going on that morning, right? And if they're just moving steady along, nothing scared them, a lot of times they're way more stretched out than you think, and I'll give you a tip on that. But what this means is that a lot of times you're going to quarter into them. Usually elk are moving into the wind, at least to some extent, and then if they're going into bedding areas, they tend to move into areas that have really shitty winds, big swirling winds. But if you can catch them in that stretch before they get to the timber, before they get to really the bedding areas, a lot of times you can quarter into them. And the idea you should think about is it's not an individual elk, unless you're specifically trying to kill an individual elk. But let's be honest, guys, like that's 5% of the scenarios. Most of you guys are just wanting to kill a bull, trying to kill a respectable bull. So this is the scenario that mostly applies. Those elk are lined out. Think of them as like a snake out there, right? And if you get to the, into 1/3 into the snake at 50%, if you're able to intercept them there, a lot of times that's perfect, because it goes back to that nudge concept. They feel like they're still in the swirl of the elk. They kind of feel like you, as an elk out there that's vocalizing, you're in the swirl too, and that matters. It matters a lot, and I don't have time to talk about it here, guys. You can go check out my course, but elk are very pecking order oriented. They know other elk 100%, right? And so there's this natural wariness when a new sounding elk shows up, but I'll leave that for the course or another video, because I could spend an hour talking about it. But the idea that you get in there, you quarter in there, and you're on their path and you're kind of in the swirl of elk now because you've quartered into them and half of them are yet to show up, half of them are already past you, that is a good scenario. Just factor in that wind component. All right, so overarching theme here on the execution of the stalk or getting closer before you set up for like your last call-in setup, right? You want to get there as fast as possible without bumping the elk. And then there's a little bit of a gray area in there because there's this concept of the last point where the elk think you are, right? So this is a very important concept. As you get closer to the elk, you need to keep track of this in your mind. There's a point where the swirl of elk think you should be. So there's two ways that point is going to move. When you first vocalize to elk, if you locate them that way, that's the point, right? Could be way far away. Now, if you vocalize when you're closer, that's the new point. If you crack a branch when you're closer, if you rake, if you inadvertently are just loud, any of that stuff, assume that the elk heard it, and that's the new point. The reason that you have to keep adjusting this point in your mind is that point is going to be where you do your archery setup off of. Hopefully, it'll be a very intentional point as close as possible to the elk, but things happen. You run into elk, you see legs 200 yards away underneath the ponderosas, and you can't get any closer. And you've got to set up right there, and it is what it is. The last time you vocalized is the last time you vocalized. The last time you broke a branch, that's where they think you're at. Let me explain that scenario to you a little bit. If you haven't been there, it may not be real clear what I'm talking about. So we're getting as close as possible to an elk that we want to call in, right? As we get closer, I step on a branch and snap it. And a lot of times bulls will actually fire off to this because they think, oh, look, that animal that was vocalized to me, that cow that was vocalized to me, now she's right here. And sometimes they'll come to you on that, right? If they're real aggressive and they're high probability of coming, they're probably already coming, right? So if you snap that branch, that bull's within 100 yards, you're probably not moving. That is the point that you have got to shift your whole setup based on, and you got to do it quick. So you're kind of under fire because that's the point now that the bull's going to be looking at as he approaches, and he's already coming your way. So you've got to either move real quick as the shooter. If you're solo, if you're a pair, you basically need to get the shooter in that position, and then you need to adjust and you need to get the caller in that position where the last vocalization was, or the last noise where the elk think you are, and you get that shooter set up based off of that position, right? It can happen real quick, and if you're not savvy to where that spot is and you're not paying attention, it's going to screw up your whole setup. Guys, I've been using onX Maps for almost 2 decades now, hunting, guiding, outfitting. It is the gold standard tool when it comes to mapping software in the hunting world. They've been a huge supporter of my content for multiple years, so if you want to support me and you want to support them, use my code CliffG for 20% off at onxmaps.com. It is an awesome tool that I use all the time when I'm preparing for hunts, and I use it almost every single day in the field. For navigation, knowing unit boundaries, knowing private land boundaries, it is the tool you have to have. All right, so let's assume that you get to choose the point, right? The last point where the bull is going to expect a cow to be standing or another bull to be standing as he comes into your setup, right? When you choose this point, you first have to understand a concept. And this concept is, again, a universal truth. And that's that when an elk comes in to a vocalization, once he's physically able to see the spot where the vocalization is, he will tend to stop and then become wary, right? If he doesn't see exactly what he expects. The reason this is such an important concept to understand is it is a predictable behavior that you can factor into the setup. So if we have a big meadow, let's say it's 90 yards wide, and we are not prepared to shoot 90 yards at an elk, and that meadow is between us and the bugling bull. The last thing you want to do is set up right on the edge of the near side of that meadow, because that bull is going to come out, he's going to get on the edge of the meadow, he's going to look across to that point where he expects that vocalizing elk to be, cow or bull, whatever vocalization you made. Maybe you were raking. Either way, he knows exactly where to look. When he sees there's not an elk there, he's going to become nervous, and he's either going to just roll out of there, or he's immediately going to go try to check wind, right? He's going to quarter in to the downwind. Everything is way lower probability now. So the perfect setup, ingrain this into your brain. Anytime you have time to do the setup, you're not under time pressure, you're not already locked down by other elk, make sure that that point where the bull comes into the setup, at that point where he's going to get wary because he sees the spot and doesn't see an elk, you are shooting the bull. So ideally, you've got a ethical distance there, 20, 30, 40 yards from that spot where he's going to come up, and he's going to be oriented in a way that you can take a shot. And usually, they're going to go right to the calling point, the last point that they heard an animal or expect an animal. They're going to come straight frontal in to that point. So this comes into something that, again, I noticed a lot over the years. Guys that only get frontal shots. Guys get frontal shots over and over and over again. I'm not saying that frontal shots you should never take them, but you really should only take them if you're pretty damn close, just because of the size. You know, that's for another video. But if you keep getting only frontal shots, it's because your setup is screwed up. You know that bull is going right into the calling point. Set up where when he comes to that point, he's broadside. It's not that hard to envision how to do that. It just takes a couple thought processes when you're doing the setup to make sure that's the case. When he pops out, when he sees that location, I'm going to have a shot that's the right distance and is at the right angle. That is the ideal scenario. Does it work all the time? No, because they'll pop out in different areas. There's lots of different reasons why it might not be perfect. But if you're thinking about it, it'll happen a lot more perfect more of the time than you think. And the reason is bulls travel through most topography in a very intuitive way. This is going to sound basic, but a lot of guys overcomplicate this. Bulls will come through terrain that's physically the easiest for them to come to. So if we have a little bench, we're on a bench, and it drops down into a chute, common for elk country, right? The bull's down there in that chute, bugling, he's responding to us. When we do the setup, we know that when he comes up that chute and he turns into the bench, there's a little open saddle there. He's not going to go through the deadfall. He's not going to go through a bunch of oak brush to get to us. He's generally going to go up that chute and make that turn into the bench. Hopefully you can visualize this. When he makes that turn, he's going to be able to see where he thinks that cow or bull should be that's been vocalizing to him. At that point, you should be sticking an arrow through him. And that means right on that little saddle, transition from the chute into the bench, the shooter should be right there. He should be right there where he gets the broadside shot at the animal. Very common setup, good to go deal. And it's based on the idea of the path of least resistance. So physically, that just makes the most sense. Why would he go through the deadfall, those sort of things? Now, if you're in really thick country, keep in mind that bulls don't like knocking their antlers off of trees. So if you've got a lot of, vertical trees, a bull will get on a path, he'll get on some opening where he's not knocking his antlers on the trees. They prefer to do that. These seem intuitive, they seem obvious, but I can't tell you how many guys get into the call-in setup and they don't use that little intuition. Look around. Where would a bull walk up in here? That he's gonna, for the most part, walk up in here that way. So use that as your baseline. A couple other things that take a little understanding, but they're close to truths, is in general, elk like to come at you, side hilling into you, same elevation or slightly above. It gives them a fighting advantage, right? They don't, even if you're cow calling, they don't know if there's a bull down there. If you're bull vocalizing, for sure, they're gonna wanna come at the same level or above, or they risk the chances of getting their asses handed to them because the bull's got the drop on them, right? So a lot of times that's the case. They'll side hill into you because of that. Now, a lot of guys will say, oh, they come in based on the wind a lot of the time. I don't believe that's a truth. They generally come in based on the other scenarios. The reason that it seems like they're coming into the wind is something's not right. something about your calling. Maybe you're calling too much. Maybe they've heard other things. Maybe they already picked up a little wind. Maybe they've seen you from a distance. I think that's probably the most common. Or they've seen the location where they expect a cow to be, and then they hit the wind. They generally, if all else is good to go and they have no reason to be nervous, they come into setups first just direct path. Easiest path of least resistance. And then when they get into that concept of I should see something, that's when they go to the wind. And that does throw into the setup. When you set up your last vocalization setup, you've got this point where you vocalize last. You've set the shooter where he's most likely going to get the shot when the animal comes up, is within distance and gives you the angle. But you should also be considering, okay, if he thinks something's up, how is he going to quarter in the wind, and do I have logical paths? This is something to think about when you do your setups, because a lot of times a bull will just slightly booger. He just seems a little bit nervous. You don't have a shot, or he just doesn't stop moving, and you don't feel comfortable taking that kind of shot, which is totally reasonable, particularly at, the further the shot gets, and he goes off. A lot of times when they go off, they'll go out of sight even, and they'll start to curl around to try to get wind. Look at some obvious paths that bull might go and see if there's any shooting lanes there as you do this setup. Because the first thing you should do as a shooter is, if that bull kind of boogers off a little bit, immediately start looking at those spots where he might swing in to catch wind. You might get a shot opportunity there. You might get a shot actually right where he's getting wind, or as he walks in to where he's going to try to get wind. So that is worth thinking about as you're doing the setup. All right, so far I've been alluding to the idea of a shooter caller setup. I'll talk about solo situations in a second, but we got to flesh this out a little bit too, because there's a couple little nuances that will help you. So when you do this, let's assume the bull's coming this path right here, right? And then we've got our shooter set up right here on the path. So the bull's going to come up here. Our shooter's right here. He's going to get that perfect broadside shot. And at that point, the bull's going to be looking over at the caller, or the last calling location. Now, if the last calling location is back here behind the shooter, we got a problem, because when the bull comes up, he's going to make that corner. He's going to be looking beyond the shooter, but the shooter is going to be right in the path, right? And the shooter's going to have to get drawn. Just inherently, the shooter might be making some movement. So the ideal situation, bull coming up, shooter here, and then we have taken that caller and he's off center, right, to the shooter. So the bull is actually looking at the caller, and the shooter has no eye contact looking through him, right? So in the ideal scenario, you want to do that. And a lot of times this will happen naturally, because when you do the setup, the caller's here, the shooter's here, the caller's here, bull starts coming up, he hangs up a little bit, caller does some calling. And just so you guys know, if you do a setup and the bull's coming your way, you don't have to call. There's no, if the bull's coming, don't call, because he's already basing it on the last sound he knows, and you've been keeping track of that, so you know where he's coming, right? The only reason you would want to call is if you need to adjust that, right? Or if he's hanging up. And sometimes they'll do that, start bugling, pretty, obvious scenario. The caller starts calling. That bull comes up, obviously where that caller is calling from is a new position. So even if 10 minutes ago, you cracked branches over here, the bull bugled till you started coming, if you took the caller and swung him out here where he wasn't behind the shooter, you swung him out here at a different angle to the entry point, then you're gonna be just right, because the bull is gonna key in on where he's expecting that animal to be that's been making the vocalization. So that's perfect. You've got the angle. Now, the obvious issue that arises is, what if you're by yourself? If you're by yourself, the best case scenario is your shooter and caller, right? So you know the spot where the bull expects you to be. If you can call there, and you know that bull's coming, he's on that last chunk, right? He's going to make that turn, and then he's going to be trying to make visual contact with that spot. You need to try to get to a shooter position in that interim period of time. That's ideal. It just is. It's not easy to do it, but if you can move over there to that shooter position as quiet as possible, and you're going to have to do it quick, that is where you're going to get those best opportunities. Solo Solo call-in setups are just difficult. So that's just how it looks, right? Call, okay, he's fired up, he's coming. I mean, he's covered this exact distance in the last 30 seconds. He's going to cover it again. I don't see any reason why he's going to change his mind. Quit calling, make a move, get in position, hope the bull pops up there, hope you don't bump him, all of those sort of things that are going to factor in. You can do that dynamic. It's kind of like the bum rush, right? A lot of people will call it that, and it does work. The problem is a lot of times you make enough noise in there that they hear that noise, and then the shooting position is now the calling position, and you've just got to deal with that. Some solo guys, it just is what it is, and they expect a frontal shot because of it. They're not going to be able to get that angle. They've got bulls coming straight into them. It's just a challenging dynamic. This is also one of the reasons why a lot of solo guys will fall back into just pure spot and stalk, because it all goes back to the metaphor of the cards, right? Now you're in very close quarters, and all you're doing when you're vocalizing is giving those animals information, and you're really stalking, right? You're stalking as close as possible, but you're giving them a location as you get closer, and that's going to affect your ability to stalk them. So hopefully that all makes sense. There's a lot of different decisions in there to make. And solo hunting is just a trickier dynamic. All right, so I'm going to get into some little contingency scenarios when it all doesn't go all right, how you can kind of pick up the pieces. I already alluded to one, taking advantage of just knowing where they might end up quartering into the downwind and getting your wind circling around you, I should say, not necessarily quartering in, but circling around you and getting that wind, knowing those paths. That's a contingency that we know is a possibility. Be prepared for it. But before I do that, I forgot to mention an important factor here. As we get in here close, right, and I've emphasized that getting close is where you're going to get the response where you actually kill elk. In order to do that, you have to realize that you're going to bump elk. In the progression of doing this, getting a feel for it, you're going to bump elk. To this day, I would say that on a third of the setups that I do, maybe a quarter on a good day, I'm bumping elk. And I view that as enough aggression. In general, guys are not aggressive enough because they're so embarrassed by bumping elk, by getting close, or they're hunting the wilderness, they're hunting the over-counter stuff, in the pain of spending 4 days to find elk and then getting too aggressive and bumping into them as you're trying to do a call-in setup is so painful. They're just overly conservative. The problem is it's a psychological trick, guys. If you're not bumping elk at all, trying to get in on these close setups, you're probably also almost never calling them in. That's the reality, right? You have to just realize that a third of the time, probably a half of the time when you first start doing this, you are going to bump a cow. You're going to bump a satellite bull. You're going to bump the herd, and it is what it is because you just got to get in there close enough. This is a cost to doing business. If you think about it that way, you will end up killing way more elk in the long run. And there's a hunting social component of this too. Nobody wants to be the dumbass that bumped into the cows when you were out there archery hunting. You don't want to be that guy in camp. Well, the reality is the guy that's that guy most often in camp, he tends to also be the guy that kills the most elk in camp. It's just the truth. There's obviously limits to this. You don't want to be an idiot. You always want to factor in the wind. You want to get good at getting close, but it's just inevitable that if you're being aggressive enough, you're gonna bump into elk sometimes getting in close to get into these high potential calling scenarios. All right, so one dynamic that comes up here is stopping the bull. So this can be an issue even if you're set up perfectly, so I'll mention it real quickly. The shooter should always be in charge of stopping the bull. If you're gonna do it with a cow call diaphragm in your mouth, make sure you practice when you're shooting your bow at home. It's a little trickier. It's actually kind of tricky to make the sound when you're at full draw. So practice it if you're going to do that, but also realize that just clicking, kissing, smooching, whatever sound is kind of easy for you to make, in the distances we're talking, it's going to stop a bull. So just figure out what you're going to do. Don't sweat it, but you should probably practice it because then you'll kind of know what you're getting into. It sounds like a little thing, but it is. I've seen people run into issues. It's about like drawing with a bino harness, right? Draw a bunch with a bino harness on. you know, with the bino harness on the layers that you're going to use when you're actually up there archery hunting. Practice like that makes all the difference, but the collar is not in charge of stopping the bull for you. All right, so let's talk about a couple other contingencies other than the obvious wind ones. So a lot of times bulls will come in and they will notice something's up, doesn't seem right. They look at the point where they expect the animal, it's not there, and they won't actually go to wind. What they'll do is they'll kind of spin off and they'll start to bark. And it's a sound that's not real difficult to make. You can listen to it on YouTube and just mimic it. That's the best. It's kind of the grunt at the end of a bugle. It's actually, it takes a lot of voice out of me to make the sound. And so they'll make that sound, and they're making it as a sound like, hey, everybody get the hell out of here, something's up. But what you can do when they make it is mimic them and then turn it into a bugle. If you do that, a lot of times it will turn them into stone pretty much. They'll sit there, and I've had bulls sit for 30 seconds, 3 minutes, just like that. And if you're in the shooter collar scenario and a bull starts doing that, starts barking back, and you can mimic and go into that bugle, it's almost kind of settles them down. They're kind of like, what, like, is there something going on? They'll stay there. If the shooter can move and shoot the bull, he better do it, because that's like the only opportunity. They're not going to stop and then start coming back in, but it will give you a moment, if you're the caller, to stun that bull where the shooter can maybe move a little bit, sneak up in there, because they'll intently look at you when they're doing that. It's a chance. Is it high probability? No. Now, the next contingency plan is bulls coming in. You do the setup. You've got it all set up where they're going to come into the perfect position, and then the woods go silent and bull doesn't show up. In this case, my biggest piece of advice is to monitor the downwind scenario, the bull going and checking wind, because he might be going to check wind without you getting any visual or making another vocalization because something seems weird. And they'll do that a lot of times. So watch those pass where you might get a shot downwind of you, right? Where that bull's gonna check for wind. Now, that's not always the case what's happening. Sometimes bulls are just being cautious, but they're still coming in. So my recommendation is to wait, and wait for 15, 20, 30 minutes if you don't see any reason why they're not coming in. So a reason why they may have left is, you know, you heard cows barking, you heard a bull bark, they saw you or heard you or smelt you, something like that. Or you felt the wind, you know, hitting the back of your neck, right? The wind got bad. So there's a logical reason why those elk might have left out of there. But if the woods go silent, even if like a shitstorm of rutting activity is occurring and it gets silent, don't just immediately get up and move. Personally, I've done this, and I think almost everybody who's elk hunted quite a bit has experienced this, moving and then bumping a bull that was just cautiously coming in there, and he was just 15 yards from showing his vitals, right? You need to be very careful of that, because that's just a scenario that occurs sometimes. Sometimes elk get cautious, but they're still coming in. So if there's not a reason why they boogered out of there, give it 20, 30 minutes. It's going to be the longest 20, 30 minutes of your life, but do it and then move on to the next setup. All right, guys, hopefully it was concise enough for you, but these are critical ideas in that setup. I'm telling you, if you start to think about the setup, you're going to start killing way more bulls. I promise you will. Just push through that, get close, do the setup right, and you're going to end up with more dead bulls. I hope you guys found value. If you want more detail, go check out my course, pursuitwithcliff.com/elk. But if you just want some more good free stuff that's here on YouTube, check out this video here, going over elk sign. I go through the nitty gritty of tracks and rubs and scrapes, all that good stuff. Go check it out. I'll catch you guys later.